June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The pencil in Anna Fitzia Vera Burkhart's hand trembled as he wrote in his hidden diary. Each word could have earned him solitary confinement if his officers ever found it. "The Americans must be lying to us," he wrote. "No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts." Through the train window, he had just seen something that made 3 years of Nazi propaganda crumble in seconds. Electric light everywhere. Farmhouses, gas stations, grocery stores, every building shone like stars across the Texas plains. It was 10 o'clock at night, and the land still glowed. When the train stopped, 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped onto the platform. Not cattle cars, not freight wagons. The entire population of Mexia turned out to watch. Children waved flags. Locals whispered to each other as they saw the German uniforms. Few realized they were witnessing something that would quietly reshape modern history, a psychological transformation more powerful than any bomb. Not by propaganda, but by reality, by the overwhelming proof of America's industrial might. General Eugen von Arnim, Rommel's successor, surrendered along with over 250,000 German and Italian troops, one of the largest capitulations in history. His diary, found decades later in the National Archives, would give historians a window into what those men saw and how captivity changed their minds forever. The first shock. Their journey began at the port of Oran, Algeria. Thousands of German POWs sat in makeshift camps, waiting for ships to take them across the Atlantic. And right away, things felt wrong. The enemy was too efficient, too organized. The US Army processed tens of thousands of men each day, photographs, identity cards, medical checks, inoculations, all handled with an ease and speed the Wehrmacht had never achieved. Even the translators spoke fluent German. Then came the food. Obrichter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote to his mother, "While we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda. Then we realized it was simply their standard ration." Crossing the Atlantic. The ships that carried them, the Liberty ships, were themselves a revelation. If someone had told the Germans that during the war, they would have called it an American lie. But it was true, and more were being built every single day. By the summer of 1943, as many as 30,000 prisoners a month were crossing the ocean on these ships' vessels that had just delivered supplies to Europe, now bringing back their enemies as cargo. Each day, the sailors threw away more food than my company received in a week. Half-eaten steaks, loaves of bread, gallons of milk. He and others realized that this casual waste, this ease, meant something far deeper. America wasn't rich by accident. It was industrial strength made visible. Arrival in America. When the ships reached Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, on August 2, 1943, the illusion of Nazi superiority collapsed completely. Private Gerhard Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr, wrote in disbelief. Every crane moved with electric power, smooth, silent. No smoke, no soot, no shouting. In Germany, only the rich owned cars. Here, even dock labourers drove to work. The train to Texas. Then came the final shock, the trains. passenger coaches with padded seats and dining cars, even observation windows. Rad quote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners. The guards apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working. Air conditioning we thought that existed only on Hitler's personal train." Because as they rolled through the night, the prisoners stared out the windows and saw an America that shouldn't exist according to everything they'd been told. Town after town glowed with electric light. Factories worked through the night. Families sat in bright living rooms. Cars lined the streets. The men began to whisper among themselves. Germany had lost long before the fighting was over. They passed through dozens of towns that first night. When a guard told them that every American town had electricity since the 1920s, the men laughed. "Lies," one shouted. The guard only smiled and said, "You'll see." At Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched in silence as American railway workers did in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours back home. Electric pumps refilled the boilers. Machines, not men, oiled the wheels. And yet what shocked the Germans most wasn't the technology. It was the people. The workers themselves looked rich. They wore sturdy leather boots that would have cost a German labourer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and tossed them aside without care. They smoked expensive cigarettes, stubbing them out halfway through. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer before the war, watched in disbelief. "The waste was magnificent," he wrote. "Lights burned in empty rooms. Fans turned in offices with no one inside. It was the carelessness of infinite resource." Factories appeared one after another, endless brick and steel stretching across the horizon. Its furnaces consumed 175,000 kilowatts of electricity, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the trains slowed beside the new Rubbertown complex, 4 synthetic rubber plants built in just 18 months. Each one employed thousands. Together, they produced 800,000 tons of rubber a year, more than 6 times what Germany ever managed. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from Ig Farben, recognized the structures immediately: the tall distillation towers, the catalytic crackers. Each facility, he recalled years later, was more advanced than anything we built, and there were 4 of them in one place. They told us there were dozens more across the country. Then I understood we could never win. Hours later, the train approached Detroit. Even from miles away, they could see it, the vast Willow Run plant, the heart of American production. "42,000 workers, 1.5 million parts, 1,500 subcontractors, all synchronized like clockwork." "We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built," he wrote. "But I could see the precision, the order, the craftsmanship. These were not weak machines, they were simply built faster than we believed possible." At St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Along both banks, vast grain elevators towered above the waterline, each one capable of feeding a city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, scribbled in his diary, "The Americans move food as we move ammunition endlessly, without fear of loss." By the time the train reached Kansas City, the air itself carried the scent of plenty. They passed immense stockyards where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants hung heavy for miles. German prisoners, men who had fought and starved in the desert, stared in disbelief at American workers eating beef sandwiches during their lunch breaks. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Corporal Paul Fisher. Then one guard walked over, smiling, and handed them something unexpected: hamburgers from a stand near the station. Warm meat, cheese, fresh vegetables, white bread. 15 cents each. And as the train pulled away, several German officers sat in silence, still chewing slowly, staring at the lights outside the window, and realizing for the first time what true abundance looked like. He bought 20 hamburgers without hesitation, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not luxury. This was normal. When the trains finally stopped at Camp Hearn, Texas, the next stage of disbelief began. The camp had been built in just 4 months, yet it looked nothing like a prison. It housed nearly 5,000 men in wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating. Each building, one prisoner wrote, contained more lumber than my entire village. For men who came from bombed cities and rationed lives, it was unimaginable comfort. The camp hospital astonished the German medical officers. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself working in a facility better equipped than most hospitals in Germany. X-ray machines, surgical tools, rows of gleaming cabinets stocked with medicine they hadn't seen since 1941. They had penicillin, Bauer later testified. We had only heard rumors of it. The camp kitchen became another lesson in abundance. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties couldn't believe what they saw. Walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, gas ovens big enough to feed an army. Today, we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, just excess. The rules say we must cook 10% more than needed to ensure full rations for all. The surplus is discarded. I cried as I threw good bread into the garbage. By September 1943, the American labor shortage led to a new order: prisoners were to work in farms and factories across the country. It was a practical decision, but it would become the most devastating blow to Nazi ideology yet. Every morning, trucks carried groups of POWs through the heart of America. No blindfolds, no restrictions. The vast fields, the shining tractors, the endless highways, the towns alive with light and movement. At a cotton gin near Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang stood watching a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could handle in a month. The farmer who owned it wasn't a party member or an industrialist, just a regular man. He had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, a tractor, Lang wrote. And this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same. Jeffreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm near Scottsbluff, recorded, "When I told him this, he laughed, said it wasn't even a good one. His father was waiting for a newer model from John Deere. For those assigned to factories, the lessons cut even deeper. By law, they couldn't work on weapons, but they could work in industries that supported war production. And so thousands of German prisoners got a front row seat to the engine of American industry. The factory was run by women and elderly men. The young were all at war, and yet output exceeded peacetime levels. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, once a food processing technician in Germany, described it. Everything was electric. Conveyor belts, filling machines, steam cookers, all automatic. One old woman managed controls that would have needed 50 workers in Germany. She did it while drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Near Detroit, others unloading coal at a power plant glimpsed the vast River Rouge complex across the water. A city of machinery, 100,000 workers building jeeps, aircraft engines, tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity every day, more than Hamburg itself. And in the parking lots, thousands of cars. Obrichter Franz Kellner wrote, "We could not believe it. In Germany, even our officers rarely owned cars. Here, the workers had two, one for work, one for family use." By winter 1943, the effect was unmistakable. American intelligence called it ideological collapse syndrome. The prisoners were changing not from lectures or propaganda, but from what they had seen with their own eyes. They began asking for American newspapers, English lessons, books, radio programs. Major Paul Noland, an officer with the S re-education program, wrote in his December 1943 report, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. They still love Germany, but they no longer speak of victory." By the end of that year, thousands of German soldiers, men who once believed in the Reich's supremacy, now faced a truth that no ideology could hide. They had lost not just a war, but an entire world they thought they understood. The change could be seen even in the camp newspapers' publications written by the prisoners themselves. At Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, a paper once filled with defiant nationalism began to change. By late 1943, its tone had shifted away from slogans and victories toward discussions of democracy, economics, and post-war rebuilding. The editors, carefully chosen anti-Nazi prisoners, noticed their audience growing more curious, more open. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a censored letter home, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, ruled by Jews, incapable of discipline or power. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful country on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals." After Italy's surrender in September 1943, Italian prisoners who agreed to cooperate were reorganized into Italian service units. They received better housing, higher pay, and more freedom. German POWs looked on in disbelief as their former allies, once treated as inferiors, now worked beside Americans, eating in restaurants, even dating American women. Heidmann Friedrich Schulz wrote bitterly in his diary, "They work freely, earn money, send parcels home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were taught to despise seems more honorable than our own system." Then came Christmas, 1943, a moment none of them would ever forget. American churches, civic groups, and charities sent over 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs men who had been fighting their sons and brothers only months before. Each box contained cigarettes, candy, soap, and games. At Camp Herne, the local Methodist church choir came to sing Christmas carols in German. Women from the town baked cakes and cookies. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards to the barracks. For many prisoners, it was the first act of kindness they had experienced in years. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have lost family to our bombs. Yet they show us kindness, not propaganda, but genuine compassion. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those certain of victory and secure in their strength." The Christmas feast itself was beyond imagination. Roast turkey and ham. Mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. Food enough for a nation, and the prisoners were told this was nothing special. Feldwebel Hans Asch wrote in his diary, "We ate like kings, better than German generals, better than party leaders. The guard said every American family eats like this for Christmas. If they feed their prisoners this way, what do their soldiers eat?" By early 1944, over 40,000 German POWs were studying in American-run educational programs. They learned English, mathematics, American history, and science. The University of Chicago sent correspondence courses. The hunger for knowledge was insatiable. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints, something impossible under Nazi censorship. American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred, he later recalled. They spoke of science as belonging to all mankind. They were years ahead of us, and they shared their knowledge with enemies. Such generosity was unimaginable in our world. Even the camp cinemas became classrooms. The Americans didn't show propaganda, they screened real Hollywood films. The prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing a nation endure defeat and rebuild from ashes. They watched The Grapes of Wrath, astonished that America would show its own poverty and struggle so openly. Lieutenant Joseph Kremer wrote, "They hide nothing. They show their failures, their injustices, yet it makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such honesty meant death. Here, it is called patriotism." By spring 1944, the labor programs expanded again. German prisoners worked in canneries, mills, and factories, seeing up close the unstoppable rhythm of American production. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, they unloaded steel that became landing craft for D-Day. 700 boats a month, 20,000 parts, each assembled by 20,000 workers. Stabsfield Rebel Kurt Zimmerman wrote, "Women doing men's work, Negroes running machinery, teenagers drilling steel. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy, and yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, day and night. They built more boats in a month than our Navy did in a year." At Republic Steel in Ohio, other prisoners watched 10,000 tons of steel pour from the furnaces each day, a single plant producing more than the entire Ruhr at its peak. I thought I understood industry, but this was beyond comprehension. They wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce. German prisoners worked across the Midwest, surrounded by endless abundance. In Kansas, a single farm produced more wheat than an entire German province. Combines rolled across golden fields, each one harvesting 100 acres a day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in a year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer with his machines does the work of 100 German farmers. They showed me aerial photos, thousands of square miles of wheat. They could lose half their crop and still feed Europe." In California's Central Valley, others picked fruit in orchards that seemed to stretch forever. They watched as perfectly good fruit was discarded oranges, peaches, apples for the smallest blemish. Mountains of produce bulldozed into pits to keep prices stable. Jeffrater Otto Scholz wrote in disbelief, "They destroy food to keep prices fair. Mountains of oranges pushed into the ground because they had too many. We begged to send them to our families in Germany. The guards pitied us but said it was impossible." For the German prisoners, it was too much to deny anymore. Everything they had been told about America, about chaos, weakness, and decay, had been a lie. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer with his machines does the work of 100 German farmers. They showed me aerial photos, thousands of square miles of wheat. They could lose half their crop and still feed Europe." In California's Central Valley, others picked fruit in orchards that seemed to stretch forever. They watched as perfectly good fruit was discarded oranges, peaches, apples for the smallest blemish. Mountains of produce bulldozed into pits to keep prices stable. Jeffrater Otto Scholz wrote in disbelief, "They destroy food to keep prices fair. Mountains of oranges pushed into the ground because they had too many. We begged to send them to our families in Germany. The guards pitied us but said it was impossible." For the German prisoners, it was too much to deny anymore. Everything they had been told about America, about chaos, weakness, and decay, had been a lie. What they saw instead was a nation of impossible wealth, compassion, and freedom, a society so confident in its power that it could treat its enemies with generosity. And for thousands of those men, that realization would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The waste was no longer shocking. It had become proof of a nation whose resources seemed infinite. Then came June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, even the most loyal Nazis broke. The numbers alone were impossible to comprehend. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave. At Camp Shelby, prisoners watched newsreels within days. They saw endless lines of ships, floating harbors built from nothing, and supply convoys landing 15,000 tons of material every single day across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed not by a barbaric enemy, but by a nation they'd been told was too weak to fight. Oberfeldwebel Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi dream. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against trucks, rifles against machines, courage against infinity. Mercy from the victors. Yet what destroyed Nazi ideology more than American power was American humanity. German prisoners found themselves treated not with cruelty, but compassion. When Sergeant Hans Müller received word that his son had died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fischer's wife wrote from Germany that she couldn't feed their children, American church groups sent her food parcels to an enemy nation still being bombed. Heidmann Otto later wrote, "They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. We thought it was propaganda until we saw it was true. They prepared us to rebuild, not to destroy." Even medical care reflected this strange mercy. German doctors worked side by side with Americans, learning techniques unavailable at home. Operations were performed on prisoners as if they were paying patients. Mental health treatment unheard of in the Wehrmacht was given freely. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "They treated suicide attempts with counseling, not punishment. Those who broke down were given therapy, not beatings. This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we had never understood the confidence of true power." The missionaries of democracy. By March 1945, the transformation was undeniable. More than 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers discussed free markets, constitutional law, and civil rights. Debate clubs argued about Germany's future. Men who had once saluted Hitler now wrote essays about rebuilding a free Germany. Former officers planned how to apply American agricultural methods when they went home. Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reichsmarschall, would later say in a 1975 interview, "We became missionaries for democracy, not through propaganda, through observation. We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than German aristocrats. We wanted that for Germany." The change was so complete that American officials began to worry the prisoners were becoming too enthusiastic. Some asked permission to stay in America after the war. Others began long-distance courtships through church correspondence programs. Many later returned, married American women, and eventually immigrated. The truth revealed. Then came April 1945. As Allied forces liberated the concentration camps, the footage reached the POW barracks. At first, many refused to believe it. They said it was propaganda until letters from home confirmed the truth. Photographs, testimony, film reels, and finally, silence. For men who had clung to pride in German honor, the revelation was unbearable. Everything they fought for was not only defeated, it was evil. Heidmann Walter Schmidt wrote the words that historians would quote for decades. "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we brought civilization to inferior peoples. We learned we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization truly meant." Return to a broken nation. When the war ended in May 1945, the prisoners faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They were going home, but home no longer existed. They had eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They had been treated with more dignity by enemies than by their own regime. In the final months, they received training, vocational classes, agricultural instruction, even political education. They learned about the Marshall Plan before it was public, realizing America intended to rebuild Germany, not destroy it. Oberfeldwebel von Tauben wrote, "They prepared us to rebuild. They gave us skills, knowledge, and hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens." Between 1945 and 1946, more than 370,000 German prisoners returned from America. They returned to ruined cities in ashes, families scattered, but they brought back something priceless, an understanding of freedom. They had seen how a democratic, industrial society truly functioned. They had witnessed a system where wealth came from cooperation, not conquest, where power served people, not tyrants. The quiet legacy. In the years that followed, many of these men helped shape the new Federal Republic of Germany. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Holstein, who taught classes at Camp Koch, became the first president of the European Commission. Rudiger von Marx, held at Kampen, served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a pioneer of German agricultural reform. They brought American efficiency to German factories, American productivity to German farms, and American ideals to German politics. The Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle of the 1950s, was born not just from aid or money, but from lessons learned in captivity. Hans Kroll would later write in his memoirs, "We learned that prosperity comes from freedom, not conquest, that democracy creates wealth and diversity brings strength, that treating workers well increases production. We saw it all behind the fences of American prison camps." Historians would one day call it the most successful re-education in history, an ideological surrender not forced by fear, but achieved through truth, abundance, and compassion. And for tens of thousands of men who once fought for the Reich, America did the one thing Germany never had. It taught them what civilization really meant. No coercion, no forced indoctrination, just observation. That was the quiet genius of America's prisoner program. Without a single bullet fired, without a single speech delivered, the United States converted hardened Nazis into future citizens of democracy. The formula was simple and devastatingly effective. It relied not on words, but on proof. They saw a society that worked, factories that ran on trust, not terror, a military that fought for liberty, not for conquest, a nation where enemies were treated with dignity and where prosperity, not propaganda, was the argument. As historian Dr. Arnold Kramer later concluded, America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism. The prisoners were converted by prosperity. The statistics tell the story. Out of 371,683 German POWs held in America, fewer than 1% ever tried to escape. Only 2,222 attempts in total, and not a single successful one. 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent, and thousands maintained lifelong friendships with the very families who had once called them enemies. Reunion of former enemies. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, over 500 former German prisoners returned to Texas for a reunion in Austin. Men, now old, grey and free. They came with their wives and children to show them the place where their world had changed. Dr. Hans V., once a prisoner at Fort Robinson and now a physician in Maine, spoke first. Life in the camps was better than the lives many of us had before the war. We discovered running water, central heating, and food without ration cards. But more than that, we discovered dignity. Then Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Meyer, who had worked on Iowa farms, stood and added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their tables, their tools, and sometimes even their homes. Their kindness changed us forever." When Oberst Hermann Gutz, then 78, took the stage for the keynote speech, the room fell silent. We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from creation, not from hatred, but from diversity, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We saw farmers feed the world, workers build victory, citizens treat enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapon was not its bombs or its tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence in liberty. We returned to Germany determined to build a society that could prosper through peace, not war. We who came as conquerors left as students. To America from your former enemies, now your friends. Thank you for showing us the way. The entire auditorium rose in a standing ovation. Americans and Germans, once enemies, now stood side by side, united by a shared transformation that began in the prison camps of Texas. The numbers behind the miracle. The scale of that transformation was staggering. Camp network. Over 500 camps across 45 states, from Maine to California. 175 main camps and 325 branch camps, most built in under 90 days. Population. 371,683 German prisoners, part of 425,000 total Axis POWs in America, arriving at a rate of 20,000 a month in 1943, 30,000 after D-Day, and more than 60,000 in the final months of the war. Labor contribution. 14 million man-days of farm labor. 100 million board feet of lumber processed. a total labor value exceeding $230 million in 1940s currency, all paid at 80 cents per day and all essential to the wartime economy. Education. Over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in courses, 135 camp newspapers published, 30,000 studied English, 15,000 trained in new trades, 8,000 completed university-level correspondence programs. Aftermath. 5,000 former prisoners later immigrated to the US. 12,000 maintained friendships through letters and average correspondence lasting 31 years. Escape rate, 0.6%. Permanent escapes, 0. American civilians harmed, none. And when asked decades later, 3 out of 4 prisoners said captivity changed their worldview for the better. The final victory. The German POWs in America didn't just witness history. They were transformed by it. Their defeat became education. Their captivity became liberation from fear, from lies, from ideology. In the end, America's greatest victory wasn't fought on battlefields. It was achieved behind barbed wire, where the sheer evidence of democracy's success accomplished what no propaganda could: the complete transformation of enemy minds. Under 90 days. Arriving at a rate of 20,000 a month in 1943, 30,000 after D-Day. Labour contribution: 14 million man-days of farm labour, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, a total labour value exceeding $230 million in 1940s currency, all paid at 80 cents per day and all essential to the wartime economy. Education. Over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in courses, 135 camp newspapers published. Aftermath. 5,000 former prisoners later immigrated to the US. Escape rate, 0.6%. Permanent escapes, 0. American civilians harmed, none. The final victory. The German POWs in America didn't just witness history. They were transformed by it. Their defeat became education. Their captivity became liberation from fear, from lies, from ideology. In the end, America's greatest victory wasn't fought on battlefields. It was achieved behind barbed wire, where the sheer evidence of democracy's success accomplished what no propaganda could: the complete transformation of enemy minds. They had arrived believing in German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the opposite was true. American power was not only overwhelming, it was civilized. From warriors to builders. When they boarded ships home in 1946, they were no longer soldiers of the Reich. They had seen how freedom created abundance. They had experienced the moral weight of a nation that could win without humiliation. The factories they built, the farms they modernized, the democracy they defended, all bore traces of what they had seen in America. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Koch, became president of the European Commission. As Hans Kroll later wrote, we learn that prosperity comes from freedom, not conquest, that democracy creates wealth, that diversity brings strength, that treating workers with respect multiplies productivity. These were lessons we learned as prisoners, and they shaped the new Germany.